This is a weather balloon, and its payload is nearly $30,000 worth of camera equipment. The photo we're trying to capture is one I've dreamt of for years and would be the result of hundreds of hours of coordination and planning with dozens of people across several states, including the OG granddaddies of launching cameras into the sky, NASA. The resulting photo is singular and stunningly gorgeous, and it will haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. Oh, I'm sorry, that was supposed to be really inspirational. Well, things don't always go according to plan. That shot, it's completely fake. I photoshopped it as, an emotional consolation prize from a weekend of back-to-back-to-back catastrophes where literally everything that could go wrong did go wrong. A weekend where we launched $30,000 worth of camera gear into the stratosphere to try and capture a photo nobody has ever captured before, and we came up almost entirely empty-handed. To understand exactly what I'm talking about, we need to back up a little bit. This is a story over 3.5 years in the making. Back in 2020, my partner Autumn and I traveled all the way to the Alaskan Arctic to try and capture the aurora borealis from the stratosphere. We succeeded in capturing some of the most beautiful footage of the aurora borealis I've ever seen, but we also experienced one of the most devastating failures of my entire life as well. Unexpected winds carried our first balloon far out into the Alaskan wilderness, never to be seen again. And to get our second camera back, we had to rent a helicopter and hike miles through the Alaskan wilderness with a shotgun. That experience was basically the dictionary definition of professional trauma, and I swore that I would never do something so crazy again. But, as they say, time heals all wounds, and recently I have found myself daydreaming of doing it all again, but bigger, better, and hopefully with less crying. So how on earth do you top that? Well, you go for an even more rare subject with an even thinner margin for error, and the absolute perfect opportunity fell into my lap earlier this year when I awoke to an email from a young woman named Kendall asking if I wanted to help her team fly a camera during the solar eclipse in October of 2023. But there was just one little catch. Kendall and her team work for NASA. Specifically, they're a part of MSGC, the Montana Space Grant Consortium, a NASA-funded university research group focused specifically on high-altitude balloon flights. This was not going to be another styrofoam cooler with string constructed in my living room. This time, we were going to do it right. The last flight was me against the world. I spent days on end scouring the internet for past research and hand-drawing my own custom designs for the payload. This project was going to be different, with an entire team of engineers and people much smarter than I am. I can focus on simply trying to capture the best images possible and leave all of the flight dynamics to people who really actually know what they're doing. We dove into this project, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and I flew to Montana to visit the lab and dive into the design and engineering of our payload. All right, cool, so I brought every camera I own. I just figured it'd be good to get some weights and see how everything fits. I'll just pull them all out. We can look at them.
I just use the screw plate down here, and it just screws in right here, and it pretty much sits perfectly.
Perhaps the biggest challenge for this flight is ensuring the camera is pointed in the right direction at the moment of the eclipse. Unlike the northern lights, which can cover the entire sky from horizon to horizon, an eclipse will happen in one very specific location at one very specific moment. So after some thorough brainstorming, we decided that rather than build a complicated, heavy, and expensive active control system, the best way to ensure the eclipse is in frame is to have 4 different cameras, each pointing in a different direction. You know, something like this would be the way to ensure that you capture every angle.
Okay.
I mean, we could use vertical real estate, and
Okay.
don't show that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't even think about that.
Because that way, just no matter what direction the eclipse is,
yeah,
we're getting it. It's equally heavy, dramatically more expensive, but so much more fun. In order to really maximize what we capture, we decided to have 2 Sony A1s filming 8K video, pointing opposite directions, and 2 Sony A7CRs shooting 62 megapixel still photos, covering the other 2 sides. By using two 14mm lenses and two 20mm lenses, we end up with a full 360-degree view, guaranteeing the eclipse will be in frame for at least one camera, no matter which direction the payload is facing. And then Kendall informed me that because the eclipse is such a rare and special event, her team has approval to launch not just one, but two additional balloons with specialty sensors. Since both balloon payloads were under regulatory weight limits for this, we figured we might as well stick a camera on those as well to really maximize our chances of success. It's difficult to explain how massive my excitement was at this point. We were no longer planning on launching a camera to photograph the eclipse. We're now planning on launching 6 full-frame professional cameras under 3 separate balloons. This went from a cool project to literally the coolest project I've ever dreamed of. As for stabilization, we decided there's no need to fix what's not broken, so we chose to implement the same stabilization system I used for my last flight. Having extended carbon fiber rods extending from the payload creates a much wider and therefore more stable platform for the cameras. And third, by far the most scary aspect, is controlling the duration of the flight. Our first flight in Alaska failed specifically because we had no way to remotely terminate the flight, and so when the balloon didn't naturally burst as intended, the entire payload drifted off hundreds of miles into the wilderness. Well, it should come as no surprise that NASA engineers are much smarter than me. They have fully engineered a flight termination cut-down system, able to be triggered remotely at any time they want. This 3D printed valve is able to vent gas from the balloon to reach a neutral buoyancy at any altitude we choose so the payload can stabilize and float smoothly for the entire duration of the eclipse. When the eclipse is over and we're ready to bring everything back to Earth, we simply send the command up to a receiver on board, which will automatically cut the balloon off and deploy the parachute. This was, by far, the most complex and intricate camera rig I have ever worked on, and I was absolutely humming with excitement as I headed back home. There was an astonishing amount of work to do and preparation, so I spent dozens of hours over the next 2 weeks fine-tuning the camera setup. I tested the flight cameras for recording duration limits, SD card speeds, and file sizes. I even put a couple A1s in my fridge and my freezer for about 12 hours to test how temperature fluctuation could impact battery life. I tested every single aspect of these cameras and how they would need to perform, and I was absolutely 100% confident in their functionality for this launch. After a frantic 16 days of prep and construction, it was finally time to load up the van and head out to the great empty desert of western Nevada for the big event. Autumn and I arrived at the launch site, a giant dry lake bed a couple dozen miles west of Winnemucca, Nevada, the afternoon before launch day. We were expecting there to be a bit of prep work to prepare the payloads for launch, and so we immediately set to work preparing the cameras. Now, I'm going to editorialize here because it is impossible for me to keep a fully neutral tone for this. It took me a full week to write this script because I just couldn't find the right words to express myself without kind of sounding like a crybaby. But part of the reason I've found success in this field is because I hold myself and those working with me to a very high standard. My job is usually incredibly fun, but behind all those beautiful days in the wilderness is an incredible amount of detailed and intricate planning. However, when we got our first look at the payloads, we realized that perhaps things were not going to be going as smoothly as we had hoped. While I had spent the last 2 weeks grinding away at preparations and testing the cameras themselves, the MSGC crew had not done what we were expecting. The boxes were exactly how I had last seen them 2 weeks ago in the lab. No adjustments had been made to any of the mounting platforms, and none of the boxes even had holes cut out for the lenses. The next few hours were frenzied and frantic, with a dozen people running around preparing various flight systems for the next morning. This is not the kind of project that you can delay in order to finish preparation, so realistically the only real solution is to just rally and spend the entire night working to try and get it to where it needs to be. The eclipse is not going to wait. Yeah, that seems good. So Autumn and I initialized all the camera equipment and then got to work installing the stabilization arms and assisting Kendall with cutting holes and assembling the payload boxes. By around midnight or so, we had the payloads built and the balloons prepped for flight, but They were not what I would say is up to my usual standard.
I kind of thought they were going to do all this in Bozeman. I didn't expect us to be troubleshooting in the dark, but it's all right. I guess the way I see it is we're here, we're going to fly it, we'll see.
These payloads were good enough. They would get the job done, but I wasn't certainly thrilled with where we had landed after so many weeks of hard work. But regardless, all the payloads really need to do is hold the camera in place, right? The balloon has to very literally do all the heavy lifting here. So we felt like the launch was still a go, and around 4 a.m. we began filling the balloons with helium. The first balloon to launch was one of the auxiliary balloons, carrying a single camera alongside some scientific equipment. Everything with this launch went perfectly, and before we knew it, this balloon was up in the air, soaring into a perfectly windless sky. The next balloon was the Big Kahuna, our grand masterpiece with 4 different cameras, each pointing a different direction under a custom, handmade zero-pressure balloon. The grand culmination of weeks of effort spread across a dozen different departments, this was truly a sight to behold. The filling crew was very busy preparing the balloon, while the instrumentation crew set to work aligning the cameras, rigging the rest of the payload, making sure they were all turned on, focused, and ready to roll. With T-minus 5 minutes to launch, Autumn and I hit record on all the cameras, sealed the payload doors, and began to align the entire payload string for the big launch. The emotion of this moment was palpable as the massive balloon floated skyward. $20,000 worth of delicate electronics connected below. In this moment, I forgot about the frustrations of the previous night and was instead overwhelmed by the incredible splendor of this crossover vehicle, blending art and science into a beautiful tapestry of photographic potential that shined in the morning sun. There was nothing in my mind at this moment but enthusiastic anticipation and unadulterated, childlike excitement for exploring the unknown and pushing the boundaries of my craft. This was the moment we had all worked towards, and there was literally nowhere to go but up.
What happened there?
It just got caught in.
Yeah, so remember how I said I briefly forgot about how janky and half-baked everything was? I remember now. There was a solid 10 minutes of stunned silence as we all tried to figure out what the sweet hell had gone wrong, and still to this day, even reviewing the footage, I'm not entirely sure. But after a few minutes of hectic scrambling, we were able to attach the rig to a backup balloon that somebody had, and we began filling. I attempted to check the payloads to make sure the cameras had survived, but I was told there wasn't enough time.
I'm just more worried about the A7CRs with the intervalometer.
No. I would, in like 15 minutes, I would just let them run because we don't want any more chaos.
Yeah, I was told that there wasn't enough time to do the only thing that I was there to do. The entire reason that this balloon was going skyward in the first place was for these cameras, and the crew simply wanted to chuck them skyward without verifying that any of them were still functioning after slamming directly into a truck. So, up and away it went, into the wild blue yonder.
Feel good?
The rest of the crew headed off to the ground control station to track the balloon position, while Autumn and I stayed behind to photograph the eclipse. We had the Sony A7R5 with the 600mm G Master attached to an equatorial mount, which is basically the camera equivalent of going quail hunting with an M1 Abrams tank. At first, we felt disappointed because of the clouds in the sky, but the coverage ended up being absolutely perfect for creating an incredibly dramatic view of the eclipse as it reached annularity. Solar eclipses always feel like you're starring in an epic battle for Middle Earth, but the clouds really pushed this one over the top. As we were packing up, we got the call from Kendall that the balloons had burst and the cameras were all safely back on the ground. For the first time that day, we were treated to a best-case scenario, and the balloon touched down only about a mile off the road. I could barely contain my excitement as we hiked out to retrieve the cameras, and as we approached, I realized this was a different balloon. The balloon we recovered was the first one we launched, a balloon that wasn't even supposed to have a camera attached in the first place. We threw one in at the last minute because we had an extra camera and figured why not.
Survived.
All right, could be worse.
It's worked, Nate.
We did it, kind of. 1 out of 6 so far, I shouldn't celebrate yet.
Yeah. Even 1 is a success.
After opening the payload and reviewing the footage, we realized that this balloon had popped nearly an hour before the eclipse and had been sitting on the ground in this field for several hours before I received the coordinates. The photos inside were actually very cool, and one of those ended up becoming the photoshopped image I showed at the beginning of this, but without the eclipse, these could have been taken on literally any balloon flight on any random day. Not exactly mission accomplished. For reasons I still cannot comprehend and probably never will really understand, the NASA crew did not tell us the coordinates for the main balloon. The main balloon with all of the cameras and all of the work. They hired me to bring these cameras, asked me to make a film about the whole process, and then didn't send me to recover the very payload that they had hired me for. Unintentional oversight? It's very possible. They aren't filmmakers after all, and perhaps they genuinely had no idea that we would want to film the recovery of the payloads. When we did eventually meet up with the rest of the crew, I was thrilled to learn that all 4 cameras had survived the journey. That's a huge financial relief for obvious reasons, but I clearly couldn't say the same for the rest of the payload. I have always been an eternal optimist, and despite everything so far, I remained relentlessly optimistic that these cameras would have life-changing images on them. We loaded the mangled wreckage into the back of the van and headed back into town to review the footage. I don't have words to describe the intense disappointment upon reviewing this footage. It is one of the first times in my entire life when my relentless optimism collapsed entirely. Not a single one of these 4 cameras functioned properly. It turns out that when the first launch attempt failed and the payload slammed into the truck, the impact was significant enough that both A1s stopped recording, and the lens elements were dislodged for the A7CRs. You can see that we go from a perfectly focused and framed shot prior to launch to immediately defocused at the moment of impact. The cameras all shifted in the subpar makeshift payload boxes, so the lenses weren't even properly aligned through the holes. For the rest of my life, I will regret not asserting myself more at that moment and insisting that I be allowed to inspect the cameras. In the rush of the moment, I felt that time was of the essence, but that simple 5 to 10 minute delay to verify the cameras were functioning would have saved this entire project. To make matters worse, this balloon also burst about 30 minutes before totality, so me delaying the launch a few minutes to check the cameras would have actually benefited the project in more than one way. There have been a few moments in my career where I've watched weeks of effort dissolve in front of my eyes. And it's never very fun, but it's always part of the job. It's just the reality of trying to push the limits. One of my greatest strengths as a creative is my ability to dream big and come up with weird and wild ideas that help set me apart from the pack. Failure is an accepted risk, and I've lost cameras, destroyed cameras, I've even broken parts of my body in the pursuit of beautiful images. But I'm not making this video simply to vent. I want to impress upon all of you the importance of perseverance. Perfection and success are pressed onto creatives and pressed upon humans in general. We don't just wish for perfection and success, we expect it and demand it of both ourselves and others. And that is our nature, to fail, but it is imperative to get back up again. Imperative to not feel shame from failure and to not shy away from it. Failure is just part of the path to success. As Thomas Edison famously said, "I have not failed. I have found 10,000 ways that don't work." Going into this project, I wanted to capture some great images and then move on, lest I become known as the camera balloon guy for the rest of my life. But I refuse to end this on a down note. I refuse to let the last chapter of this story be a dejected man disappointed by the outcome. If anything, this has motivated me more than ever. It's motivated me to push onwards and upwards, literally, to start back at the beginning of the drawing board and to try and do this right. This story is not over, and you have not seen the last of me launching cameras into the sky.